Singapore 6 is ready for departure. Singapore 6, runway 05 left, taxi into position and hold. In just 30 seconds, everything will go wrong. Outside, a typhoon is closing in. Rain hammers the cockpit windows. The runway is slick. Visibility is falling fast. But the airport is minutes from shutting down, and the flight must depart. The captain eases the throttles forward. Engines roar. Wheels roll. The 747 begins to accelerate. 100 knots. 120. The wipers can barely keep up. And then, suddenly, shapes emerge from the storm. Lights, metal, concrete, heavy construction equipment right in their path. The captain's eyes go wide. There's no time to think, no time to stop. The aircraft barrels forward toward disaster. This is Inside AeroDisasters, and this is the story of Singapore Airlines Flight 006, and how a wrong turn in the rain became one of aviation's most avoidable tragedies. Chiang Kai-shek International Airport, Taipei. 3 runways, multiple taxiways, and a layout that, on most days, handled traffic without issue. But on October 31st, 2000, it was a setup primed for disaster. The airfield's primary runways were 05 left and 06, both used routinely by Singapore Airlines. A third, lesser-known strip, runway 05 right, ran parallel to 05L, but it was never supposed to be a runway in the first place. Originally built as a taxiway, 05R had been reinforced and repurposed as a contingency runway during airport expansion. It lacked the standard infrastructure for landings, no instrument landing system, no full lighting configuration, and narrow by comparison. And over the years, it saw little to no actual traffic. For all practical purposes, 5R was a taxiway with a runway number painted on it. In early October 2000, Taiwan's Civil Aeronautics Administration authorized repairs to the center section of 05R. The plan, cordon off the middle between taxiways, N4 and N5, leaving both ends open for aircraft to taxi through. Construction equipment, excavators, steamrollers, rebar, was left in place, surrounded by concrete barriers and flashing red lights. The runway remained lit at both ends, but no X markings, no physical barricades, and no change to the lighting scheme at the thresholds. The runway number markings, 05R, were still painted in full view. To pilots unfamiliar with the specifics, it looked like a usable runway. For Singapore Airlines Flight 006, the assigned departure runway was 5L. The aircraft was parked at Gate B5, the expected taxi route east on taxiway SS, right onto West Cross, then southbound via taxiway November Papa, and finally a right turn at taxiway N1 to align with 05 left. Captain Fung Chi Kong briefed the taxi route in detail, pointing it out to First Officer Latif Cyrano. The expected path required bypassing 5R entirely, crossing it, not entering it. But that's not what happened. Ground control issued a different clearance via Sierra, West Cross, then November Papa to N1. The change was subtle, but crucial. It offered a shorter path to runway 05 left, and on paper it was safe. But here's where the trap was set. Taxiway N1 intersects both 05R and 05L. Pilots reaching N1 would see 2 potential runways ahead, a near one, 05R, and one 300 meters farther, 05L. The correct route required continuing straight on N1 to reach 05 left, but under intense rain, limited visibility, and green taxiway lights stretching rightward, it was easy to mistake 05 right as the assigned runway. What made this especially dangerous was the lighting configuration. International standards required at least 16 centerline lights in the critical transition zone from N1 to 05L. Taipei had just 4. One of them was unlit, another barely glowed. Meanwhile, the curve onto 05R was brightly illuminated. Its lights were spaced closer together, making the wrong path appear more obvious than the correct one. There was no ground radar. Controllers in the tower could not physically see the plane. They had no way of verifying its exact position during taxi. And crucially, no clearance was given to cross runway 05R because it was assumed closed. But the crew, seeing green lights and no barricade, interpreted the lit surface ahead as the departure point. To complicate matters further, runway centerline lights on 05R remained green, the same color used for taxiways, not white as required for active runways. Another silent clue. But in poor visibility and under time pressure, the difference was missed. In retrospect, this was not a single error, but a setup of compounding failures. An airport with incomplete lighting, poor signage, and an ambiguous runway-to-taxiway conversion. And into that setup taxied a fully loaded 747, its crew unaware that every guiding light they trusted was leading them onto a trap. By the time Singapore Airlines Flight 006 began taxiing at 11:07 p.m., the effects of Typhoon Zhang were already degrading flight conditions. Surface wind was reported at 020 degrees at 24 knots, gusting up to 43. Visibility had dropped to 400 meters. Heavy rain pounded the cockpit windows. Water collected on the taxiways, reducing surface friction and increasing the risk of hydroplaning. These were not abnormal conditions for a major airport, but they demanded precision. Inside the cockpit, Captain Fung Chi Kong remained focused on caution. He instructed his crew to taxi slowly and deliberately, stating multiple times that they would avoid rushing. This mindset, conservative and procedural, was the right one. But even with this approach, one problem remained. None of the three pilots had taken off from runway 05L in recent memory. According to the investigation, it had been more than 3 years since any of them had last used it. Familiarity was limited. As they followed the clearance along Sierra and West Cross taxiways, they transitioned onto November Papa, just as briefed. At this point, their progress matched expectations. But November Papa ended at taxiway N1, and that's where everything depended on moment-by-moment judgment. The critical moment came as the aircraft turned onto N1. At this junction, visibility through the windshield was degraded by rain. The windshield wipers, although activated, struggled to clear the view fully. The cockpit crew's external cues were limited to green taxiway lights and the vague outline of pavement. From their position, 2 runways were potentially visible. The nearer one, runway 05R, was not just closer, it also appeared more clearly lit. Its entry curve glowed with frequent green centerline lights. In contrast, the route ahead to 5L was dark, with wide light spacing and 2 defective lights. This optical imbalance biased the crew's perception, creating the illusion that the brighter, nearer runway was the intended one. Cognitive bias began to take hold. The type of error involved is known as confirmation bias, the human tendency to interpret new information in a way that confirms existing beliefs or assumptions. In this case, Captain Fung had already committed to turning right at N1 to enter the runway. Once on the curved path, the assumption that they were on 05L solidified. The cockpit crew began filtering incoming visual information through that frame. But several discrepancies were present. The aircraft's paravisual display, PVD, a visual alignment tool that uses localizer signals to confirm runway alignment, remained shuttered. Under normal conditions, the PVD should have activated once the plane entered the alignment zone for 5L. The fact that it didn't open was an immediate indicator. They were not where they thought they were. First Officer Latif noticed it. "And the PVD hasn't lined up," he remarked aloud. Relief pilot Ong responded, suggesting they might not yet be within 45 degrees of the runway heading. This explanation, although technically plausible, was incorrect in this case. But the suggestion was accepted. Captain Fung dismissed the discrepancy. "Never mind, we can see the runway. Not so bad." This single sentence encapsulated the breakdown. Visual confirmation, the mere appearance of a runway ahead, was trusted more than instrument feedback. Yet the evidence against that visual assumption was present in the cockpit. The aircraft's primary flight display, PFD, featured 2 key indicators. The magenta localizer diamond, a symbol showing runway alignment, was offset, signaling they were not centered with the intended ILS beam. The runway symbol on the navigation display was also shifted, pushed to the far side of the screen. Neither cue was discussed in the cockpit. The crew's attention at that point was split. Captain Fung was taxiing the aircraft manually in low visibility. First Officer Latif was monitoring speed and handling checklists. Relief pilot Young was verifying updated crosswind calculations. No one explicitly revalidated their runway position. Despite noting the PVD issue, the crew proceeded to complete the final checklist. Latif called for takeoff readiness. Tower clearance was received for runway 05 left, but ATC, lacking ground radar, could not confirm the aircraft's location visually. From the flight deck, the lights, markings, and layout of 5R did not appear unusual enough to trigger suspicion. The edge lights were likely active. The runway centerline lights were green, technically a clue that this was not an active runway, but again, not questioned. There were no visible closure markings, no red X, no physical barriers across the threshold. The environment had presented inconsistencies, but the crew, operating under time pressure and visual constraints, interpreted only what aligned with their expectations. By the time takeoff thrust was set, the mistake was already locked in. Flight 006 was not aligned with runway 05L. It was accelerating down 05R toward a construction zone filled with heavy machinery, and the flight deck, operating on a false visual confirmation, had no idea. For Flight 006, the final mistake may have been made in the cockpit, but its conditions were engineered on the ground. At Taipei's Chiang Kai-shek International Airport, runway 05R had not been used as an active runway for years. Originally a taxiway, it had been upgraded to a backup runway during terminal expansion in the 1970s, but rarely used due to limitations in width, lighting, and safety clearance zones. It was never certified for landings and was frequently bypassed in daily operations. By late 2000, it was essentially obsolete. Still, it retained all the visual characteristics of a functioning runway. The runway number 05R was freshly painted at the threshold. The white piano keys marking the start of the runway remained intact. There were no X markings to indicate closure. Most critically, lighting cues were inconsistent with its actual status. In October 2000, Taiwan's Civil Aeronautics Administration authorized partial repairs to the middle section of 05R. The work zone between taxiways N4 and N5 was marked off with concrete barriers and flashing red lights. However, both ends of 5R were left accessible for taxiing. This meant no permanent barricades could be placed at either end. Aircraft could still physically enter the runway surface from taxiway N1. From an infrastructure perspective, that decision created ambiguity. Green taxiway centerline lights, used to guide aircraft safely across the airfield, were prominently installed on the curve leading from N1 onto 05R. Their spacing, just 7.5 meters apart, made the arc visually dominant. In contrast, the centerline lights leading straight ahead towards 05L were spaced 30 meters apart, far wider than international standards. The first light was inoperative. The second was dim. There should have been at least 16 centerline lights between N1 and the entry point to 05L. Taipei had installed only 4. At least one was effectively invisible. The prescribed visual path was there, but it was too faint to be trusted. Meanwhile, investigators could not definitively determine whether 5R's runway edge lights were active at the time of the accident. Some witnesses, including Captain Fung, claim they were. Security footage from the control tower showed no visible runway edge lighting, but video quality was poor. Metallurgical testing of severed edge lighting wires showed arcing, which can only occur when the wires are live. Whether this occurred before or after the accident remained unresolved. Even without confirmed edge lighting, other visual factors were misleading. Because 05R originated as a taxiway, its centerline lights were green, a non-standard color for active runways. Active runways are required to use white centerline lighting, but in heavy rain and low visibility, these nuances are difficult to perceive, especially when both green and white lights are visible, overlapping on wet pavement, reflecting against glass, distorted by motion and windshield rain patterns. The airport had also failed to install runway guard lights, a pair of alternating yellow strobes at the entry point to runway 05 left. These lights, standard at most commercial airports, are designed to highlight the beginning of an instrument runway, especially in low visibility operations. Taipei had none. Their absence eliminated one of the last chances for a visual cross-check. Despite the partial closure of 5R, the airport left its threshold lights, numbering, and markings unaltered. Under ICAO rules, a permanently closed runway must have all such identifiers removed or physically crossed out. Yet Taiwan's CAA had postponed the official redesignation of 05R as a taxiway, citing delays in signage procurement. As a result, 5R existed in an operational gray area, neither an active runway nor formally closed. This created a regulatory loophole. From the cockpit of Flight 006, everything they saw was plausibly consistent with a valid departure runway. The layout wasn't ideal. The lights weren't perfect. But in poor visibility and under time pressure, nothing appeared definitively wrong. The airport's infrastructure had created a condition known in human factors as latent failure, an unnoticed system-level flaw that waits for the right chain of actions to trigger a disaster. And on that night, every weak point aligned. In any controlled airport environment, air traffic control is expected to be the last line of defense. Controllers monitor surface movement, issue clearances, and, when possible, intervene before an aircraft makes a critical error. But on the night of October 31, 2000, that safeguard was effectively blind. At Taipei's Chiang Kai-shek International Airport, there was no ground movement radar. Controllers in the tower relied entirely on visual observation of taxiing aircraft. Under good weather conditions, this was acceptable. But that night, visibility had dropped to just 400 meters, and it was raining heavily. The storm had rendered the tower's view of the taxiways and of Flight 006 essentially useless. When Singapore Airlines 006 contacted Taipei ground for taxi clearance, they were issued a route via taxiways Sierra, West Cross, and November Papa. No instruction was given to cross runway 05R because ATC considered it closed and presumed that no aircraft could physically enter it. This assumption would prove dangerously incorrect. As the aircraft taxied along the assigned route, controllers in the tower could no longer see it. There were no cameras, no surface radar, and no position tracking tools. ATC had no way to monitor Flight 006's precise location once it left the apron. The entire clearance system was based on radio check-ins and trust. Once the aircraft approached taxiway N1, the transition point towards 05L, Captain Fung instructed his first officer to notify tower that they were ready. "Tell them we are ready, La." "Singapore 6 ready," Latif radioed. This call came early, before the aircraft had actually reached the hold short point for runway 05L. Tower controllers, unable to see the aircraft, assumed they were correctly positioned at the threshold. The reply came promptly: "Singapore 6, runway 05L, taxi into position and hold." At this point, Tower had already cleared a plane for takeoff, on faith alone. This clearance carried a silent error. Under normal protocol, if an aircraft is required to cross an inactive runway to reach the active one, the instruction should explicitly include cross runway 05 right. But because 05R was assumed closed, the phrase was omitted. The crew, meanwhile, saw green taxiway lights and no barriers, so their mental model interpreted this as a valid taxi route onto the departure runway. Once the aircraft lined up on what they believed was 05 left, Tower issued the final instruction: "Singapore 6, runway 05 left, wind 020 at 28, gusting 40, cleared for takeoff." That transmission, read back by the crew without correction, was based on the assumption that Flight 006 was on the proper runway. But the controllers had no visual or electronic confirmation. They could not verify alignment, and they could not see the runway surface through the storm. This gap in situational awareness represented a systemic flaw. In high-traffic international airports, surface movement radar, SMR, is a standard safeguard. It allows controllers to see aircraft locations in all weather conditions. Taipei lacked this tool. The airport had not yet modernized its ground surveillance systems. The other missing element was procedural. There was no industry-wide requirement at the time for pilots to verbally confirm runway alignment before takeoff. A simple cross-check, "Confirm runway 05 left," was not part of the standard checklist. ATC assumed the aircraft was where it said it was. The crew assumed ATC knew where they were. This mutual assumption created a gap, a procedural void. In hindsight, it is clear that Flight 006 was never actively monitored during taxi. Controllers issued clearances based on flight plan expectations, not real-time observation. The decision to clear takeoff was made without visual or electronic validation, and no controller questioned the early call stating readiness at the runway. Ultimately, the clearance to take off from runway 05L was issued to a plane sitting on runway 05R. No one in the tower knew it. At 11:16 p.m., Flight 006 was cleared for takeoff. The cockpit checklist was complete. The crosswind component had been recalculated, still below maximum limits. Cabin crew reported ready. The rain was relentless, but within operational tolerances. The aircraft was lined up. The engines spooled to take off thrust. But the aircraft was not on runway 05L. It was accelerating down runway 05R, a runway closed for construction, obstructed by heavy equipment, and marked only by flashing red lights at its center section over 1 kilometer away. Inside the cockpit, none of the 3 pilots noticed the misalignment. The paravisual displays, PVDs, remained closed, indicating that the aircraft was not within the localizer signal of 5L. But with visibility between 400 and 650 meters and the runway surface faintly visible ahead, the discrepancy was dismissed. As the throttles advanced, the Boeing 747 surged forward. The pilots called out speeds by the book. 80 knots. V1. Rotate. At this point, there was no longer any possibility of aborting the takeoff. V1, the decision speed, had been passed. The aircraft was committed. 17 seconds into the takeoff roll, traveling at 142 knots, the nose began to lift. Then impact. The aircraft's nose gear struck a concrete jersey barrier, part of the cordon surrounding the construction zone at mid-runway. Simultaneously, the left main gear collided with a deep pavement excavation. Metal sheared. Tires exploded. A fraction of a second later, the aircraft slammed into a large excavator, which was driven beneath the left wing and forced upward into the tail section, severing the left horizontal stabilizer. The plane yawed violently left. The nose pitched down and slammed into the ground. Both left engines detached. The number 2 engine collided with piles of steel rebar, tearing apart the wing's lower surface. Fuel lines ruptured. The aircraft's structure began to disintegrate. As the fuselage skidded sideways across the runway, the right wing dipped. The number 3 engine broke off and cartwheeled across the tarmac. The tail struck 2 stationary steamrollers, causing the rear fuselage to tear just behind the wings. Within seconds, a fireball ignited beneath the center fuselage, where wing tanks and fuel lines converged. Flames engulfed the midsection. The forward fuselage, now barely intact, rotated 180 degrees, then collapsed onto its side. The aircraft came to rest in 3 main sections. The tail torn free and rotated to the left side of the runway. The center fuselage fully ablaze. The forward section tilted and crumpled. Its nose gear collapsed. The aircraft broke apart less than 33 seconds after takeoff began. Passengers near the wings were exposed to ruptured fuel tanks and collapsing structure. Fire and smoke spread within seconds. Many didn't have time to react. On the upper deck, smoke funneled through the stairwell. One slide deployed but was quickly disabled by fire. The cockpit crew, largely unharmed, exited last. At the detached tail, every passenger survived thanks to the absence of fire and fuel. Most escaped through a fuselage break. Rescue crews arrived within minutes, but fire burned for 40 more. All 83 fatalities, including 4 crew, occurred in the center and forward sections. The cause, a high-speed collision with construction equipment on a closed runway. Taiwan's Aviation Safety Council, ASC, concluded the crew mistook 05R for 05L due to poor visibility, stress, and weak visual cues. Singaporean authorities agreed but emphasized airport failings, poor lighting, lack of barriers, and ambiguous runway status. Both sides acknowledged key issues. No runway position verification before takeoff. No ground radar to monitor aircraft taxi paths. No criminal charges were filed. 2 pilots were sanctioned and dismissed. The 3rd was cleared. Singapore Airlines retired the flight number and compensated victims' families. All lawsuits were settled out of court. Reforms followed. Runway 05R was decommissioned. Lighting systems were upgraded. Airlines adopted stricter runway confirmation procedures. Cockpit tech, like moving maps and runway awareness tools, became standard. Flight 006 became a defining case of how routine operations can unravel. Not through recklessness, but through system gaps and human assumptions. The lesson? Pilot error is often the final link, not the first. True safety begins with the system. If you found this breakdown informative, consider subscribing for more deeply researched aviation stories, where we analyze not just what went wrong, but why. Hit the like button to support our work and let us know in the comments which incident you want us to cover next, because sometimes the smallest detail can make all the difference.